Welcome back to the Paranormal Inc. Ohio podcast. Tonight is a special episode. Tonight we're going to talk about real reports of near-death experiences in hell and what may await beyond death. This one's called I Went to Hell and Came Back. What happens when you die? It's one of the oldest questions human beings have ever asked. Every civilization has had an answer. Some believe we enter heaven. Some believe we are reincarnated. Some believe we enter a spiritual realm. Some believe there is nothing after death at all. And then there are those who say they already know. People who say their hearts stopped. People who say they were clinically dead or on the edge of death. People who say they left their bodies and went somewhere else. Some describe beautiful lights. Some describe dead relatives. Some describe overwhelming peace, but others tell a very different story. They say they saw darkness. They say they felt completely alone. They describe fire, terror, demons, creatures, and places they believed were hell. Tonight we're going to hear some of those stories, but we're also going to dig deeper. Because what exactly is hell? Where is it supposed to be? Is hell underground? Is it another dimension? Is it a spiritual state? And why do different religions describe hell in such different ways? And perhaps the biggest question of all, when someone says they died and went to hell and came back, did they actually go there? Or could the human brain create an experience so powerful that it feels like another world? Tonight we're going to look at the stories, we're going to look at the history, we're going to look at the science, and then I'll leave the final question to you. Because when it comes to what happens after death, nobody who's alive can honestly say they know everything. I'm your host, Ed. This is Paranormal Inc. Ohio podcast. Turn down the lights, get comfortable. And if you're listening alone, maybe don't turn them down too far. Because tonight, we're going to hell. Before we hear the stories, there's something we need to understand. The hell most of us picture today isn't necessarily the same hell that people throughout history imagine. When you hear the word hell, you might picture an underground kingdom, rivers of fire, souls screaming, demons with horns, a throne belonging to Satan, made out of skulls. But that image is actually the result of thousands of years of religious traditions, cultural beliefs, artwork, literature, and interpretation. The word hell itself doesn't translate neatly into one single ancient concept. In the Hebrew Bible, there's Sheol. Sheol is generally associated with the realm of the dead or the grave. Then there's Hades, the Greek term for the realm of the dead. And there's Gehenna, which is associated with the valley of Hinnom near Jerusalem, and later became connected with ideas of judgment and punishment. There's also Tartarus, a term from Greek tradition associated with a deep region of punishment and used in the New Testament in connection with imprisoned fallen angels. So already we have a problem. If someone asks, where is hell? Which hell are we talking about? Because different cultures have imagined it differently. Christianity has multiple interpretations of hell. Some Christians understand hell as eternal punishment. Some understand it as primarily as separation from God. Some believe in annihilation, the idea that the wicked ultimately cease to exist. And others have different theological interpretations. Islam has Jahannam, a place of punishment described in Islamic scripture as tradition. Ancient Greek mythology had the realm of Hades and the deeper region of Tartarus. And then there is one of the most influential literary descriptions of hell ever created, Dante's Alighieri's Inferno. Dante imagined hell as a series of circles, each associated with different sins and punishments. The important thing to remember is that Dante was writing poetry and theology, not documenting a physical expedition. But his imagery became enormously influential. Over hundreds of years, paintings, books, sermons, movies, television, and popular culture blended all of these ideas together. And that's how we ended up with the familiar image of hell: fire, demons, pits, darkness, eternal suffering. But here's the important part. There is currently no scientifically verified physical location of hell. No coordinates, no underground cavern, no planet, no dimension that science has confirmed as hell. So when people say they've been there, we're talking about something very different. We're talking about an experience. Some of those experiences are absolutely terrifying. Before we get into the stories, let's clear another thing up. When someone says I've died and came back, it usually doesn't mean they experienced irreversible biological death and somehow returned. In many cases, they're describing cardiac arrest, severe trauma, drowning, or another medical emergency during which they were unconscious, had no detectable pulse, or were considered extremely close to death. Modern medicine has become remarkably good at bringing some people back after cardiac arrest. Something fascinating has emerged from that. Some survivors report experiences during the periods surrounding their resuscitation. These experiences are commonly called near-death experiences, or NDES. Researchers have studied them for decades. In one major study, AWARE 2 investigated consciousness and brain activity during cardiac arrest and CPR. Researchers found that some survivors reported memories or perceptions associated with their cardiac arrest. They also observed periods of organized brain activity in some patients during resuscitation. Now, that doesn't prove heaven. It doesn't prove hell. It doesn't prove that consciousness leaves the body. But it does tell us something important. The relationship between the dying brain and consciousness is more complicated than we once thought. And that brings us to our first story. Howard Storm. Howard Storm was a professor and artist who reported one of the most dramatic Christian near-death experiences ever publicly described. Storm became critically ill while traveling in France. According to his account, his condition deteriorated severely. He believed he was dying. Eventually, he described losing normal awareness of his surroundings, and then he said he died. What happened next would stay with him for the rest of his life. Storm reported finding himself in darkness. Then he encountered beings that initially appeared to be human. According to his testimony, they encouraged him to follow them, and he did. But the farther he went, the stranger everything became. The beings became increasingly hostile. Storm reported being attacked and tormented. He described the experience as terrifying. And eventually, he came to believe that he was in hell. But here's what makes his story especially interesting. Storm said he began calling out to God. According to his account, his experience eventually changed. He described encountering Jesus, who he believed rescued him from the beings tormenting him. Storm later described the experience publicly and said it completely transformed his life. Whether someone believes his interpretation is another question. We have his testimony. We know he experienced a serious medical crisis, but we do not have scientific evidence establishing that he literally traveled to a supernatural hell. Still, his story raises an uncomfortable question. Why would a person experiencing a medical crisis perceive something so incredibly vivid? And why did he interpret it as a place of eternal punishment? Let's hold on to that question, because we're going to hear it again. Now we're going to talk about Bill Wiese. And I have made a podcast episode dedicated to Bill Wiese and the Dante's Inferno. So you guys want to, you can go check them out. But another famous account comes from Bill Wiese. Wiese has publicly described that he calls 23 minutes in hell. According to his testimony, he experienced an extraordinarily frightening event in which he found himself in a place he interpreted as hell. He described intense heat, a horrible environment, a terrible smell, and beings he interpreted as demons. He described being physically tormented. one of the most disturbing aspects of his story isn't simply the pain, it's the feeling of being trapped. Imagine believing that you've died, and there's no way back. No hospital, no family, no friends, no rescue, no morning when you wake up, no end, just suffering, punishment, forever. According to Weiss, the experience eventually ended and he returned to his normal life. He later became a Christian and author and used his experience as a warning about the consequences of sin. Again, we need to make the distinction. His experience is a personal testimony. Science has not established that he physically traveled to a supernatural location. But something about these stories is interesting. Storm described darkness and hostile beings. Weiss described darkness, torment, and beings as he interpreted as demons. Different people, different circumstances, yet similar themes. And that brings us to another question. Are these similarities evidence that they're seeing the same place? Or could the human brain produce similar experiences under similar circumstances? We'll never know. Now we're going to move on to Don Piper. We're going to go in the opposite direction now, because not every person who reports a near-death experience describes hell. Some describe heaven. One of the most famous is Don Piper. Piper was involved in a serious automobile accident. According to his account, his vehicle was struck by a tractor trailer. The injuries were catastrophic. He later reported that he was dead for approximately 90 minutes. And during that period, Piper says he experienced heaven. He described an overwhelming sense of peace. He reported encountering people he recognized as deceased friends and relatives. He described an incredibly beautiful environment. There was no terror, there was no darkness, no demons. Instead, there was love, peace, and joy, and a feeling that he had arrived somewhere he belonged. Eventually, according to his account, he returned to consciousness, and he was alive. Think about the contrast. Howard Storm says he experienced something terrifying. Bill Weiss describes hell. Don Piper describes heaven. Three people, three radically different experiences. And that brings us to one of the biggest mysteries surrounding NDES. Why aren't they all the same? If everyone is visiting the same afterlife, why don't everyone see the same thing? Some researchers believe culture and religious expectations may influence how people interpret unusual experiences. A Christian might interpret an experience using Christian imagery. Someone from another religious background might interpret it differently. And someone with no religious background might not interpret it as an afterlife at all. That's one possibility, but there are other theories. Some are much stranger. Some people who report frightening NDES don't describe fire. They don't describe demons. They don't describe giant monsters. They don't describe something simpler. Darkness, complete darkness. Imagine being conscious, but unable to see your own hands. You can't hear your family. You can't feel the hospital bed. You don't know where you are. You don't know how you got there. And you don't know how long you've been there. There's no clock, no sunlight, no morning, no night, just darkness. Some people have described this as an overwhelming feeling of isolation. Not simply, I'm alone, but I'm completely cut off from everything. And if someone already believes that hell means separation from God, that experience could be interpreted as hell. But then comes another disturbing possibility. What if there isn't anything there? What if the terror comes from the absence of everything? Because sometimes the human imagination doesn't need demons or devils. Sometimes nothingness is enough pain and torture of it all. Not everyone who reports a hellish near-death experience is famous. In fact, most aren't. They're ordinary people. People involved in accidents, people who nearly drowned, people who suffered cardiac arrest, people who experienced medical emergencies. And some say that while their bodies were failing, they experienced something completely different. Some describe enormous dark spaces. Some describe pits, fire, or freezing darkness. Some describe other people's suffering around them, and some describe entities. Sometimes these entities are described as human-looking, sometimes monstrous. Sometimes they aren't even seen. The person simply knows that something is present, something dangerous, something that doesn't belong. And that sensation of malevolence is fascinating because it's also found in paranormal reports outside of NDES. People visiting supposedly haunted locations sometimes describe suddenly feeling watched, feeling sick. God knows I have in multiple places that I have paranormal investigated. Feeling overwhelming dread, feeling like they have to leave. Of course, there can be normal explanations, but the human brain constantly processes subtle environmental signals, sounds, smells, temperature, movement, memory, fear, context. All these can influence how we perceive a location. But during an extreme medical crisis, those symptoms and those systems could behave in ways we don't fully understand. And that brings us to the question we can't avoid anymore. What exactly is happening inside the brain when a person is dying? Let's take a step away from religion, step away from paranormal theories, and let's talk about science. When the heart stops pumping effectively, blood flow to the brain is disrupted. Oxygen levels change, the body's chemistry changes, brain activity changes, and the entire system becomes unstable. But death isn't necessarily an instantaneous switch. The process is complicated, and research has shown that brain activity can sometimes continue during periods surrounding cardiac arrest and resuscitation. The AWARE 2 study investigated people who suffered cardiac arrest in hospitals. Some survivors reported memories or perceptions associated with the event. Researchers also detected organized brain activity in some patients during CPR. It doesn't prove an afterlife, but it does challenge the simplistic idea of consciousness. Necessarily disappears instantaneously the moment the heart stops. The brain is extraordinarily complex. The dying brain may produce experiences that we still don't completely understand. Some researchers have proposed explanations involving oxygen deprivation. Others have explored neutralism or neutron transmitters and altered brain states. Others have suggested that multiple psychological processes may contribute, but there is still no universally accepted explanation for every aspect of NDES, and that leaves room for debate. Here's where things get complicated. Suppose a person is dying. Their brain is under extreme stress. Their body is changing rapidly. Their memories, fears, beliefs, and emotions are interacting with altered brain activity. Could that produce an incredibly vivid experience? Absolutely it can. Could it feel completely real? Yes, it can. But here's where the mystery continues. Some people report details that they believe they couldn't have known. Some describe conversations. Some report seeing things from perspectives outside their bodies. Some report experiences that seem extraordinarily structured. Those claims are controversial and difficult to vary, but that's why researchers continue studying NDES. The scientific question isn't, can we prove hell? The scientific question is, what happens to consciousness during extreme physiological crisis? That's a question we can investigate. And the answers may eventually tell us something extraordinary about the human brain. But they still might not answer the biggest question. Does consciousness survive death? Now let's go back thousands of years, because humanity has been thinking about hell for a very long time. In Jewish tradition, Sheol is associated with the realm of the dead. It's not simply identical to the modern Christian image of hell. Later traditions developed concepts involving judgment and purification, including Gehenna. Christianity developed multiple ideas surrounding hell. Some traditions emphasize eternal punishment. Others emphasize separation from God. Others believe the wicked ultimately cease to exist. Islam describes Jahannam, a place of punishment associated with fire and judgment. Ancient Greeks imagined Hades, the realm of the dead, with Tartarus representing a much deeper place associated with punishment. And then Dante comes along. In his Inferno, hell becomes a massive structure of circles, different sins, different punishments, different levels. And Dante's imagination, mad, and had a massive influence on the way Western culture pictures hell. But here's what I want you to remember. Dante didn't physically travel to hell. He was creating literature. The popular image of hell is therefore a mixture of theology, mythology, literature, art, and culture. So when someone says, "That's what hell looks like," ask, according to which tradition? Because the answer changes depending on who you ask. Now let's answer the question that everybody wants to know. Where is it? Is it underground? For much of human history, that was an understandable idea. Ancient cosmologies often imagined heaven above, the underworld below. But modern science doesn't support the idea of literal underground kingdom beneath Earth's surface. We've studied the Earth's interior. We know the planet has layers: crust, mantle, outer core, and inner core. None of them has been shown to contain a supernatural realm. So maybe hell isn't underground. Maybe it's somewhere in space. But we've never detected it. Maybe it's another dimension. There's no scientific evidence proving that either. Maybe it's spiritual. And if it's spiritual, perhaps asking for coordinates doesn't make sense. Maybe hell isn't a place in a physical space. Maybe it's a state of existence. Maybe it's separation. Maybe it's consciousness without physical reality. Or maybe it's something we don't have a scientific framework for yet. And that's where the paranormal question begins. Let's put science aside. Let's ask the forbidden question. What if they're right? What if consciousness really can exist independently from the body? What if the brain doesn't create consciousness, but somehow receives it? What if death isn't the end of awareness? And what if some of these people actually crossed a boundary between our world and another? If that's true, then maybe hell isn't underground. Maybe it doesn't have coordinates. Maybe it isn't made of matter. Maybe it exists somewhere beyond the physical universe. And perhaps that's why we can't find it. There's another possibility. Maybe these experiences are entirely generated by the brain. Maybe a dying brain can create landscapes, people, voices, monsters, light, darkness, and entire worlds. Maybe fear and memory combine with altered consciousness to create an experience that feels more real than normal life. If that's true, it's still extraordinary. Because the human brain may be capable of creating experiences so powerful that people wake up convinced they've literally visited another realm. One of the most interesting aspects of NDES isn't always what people see, it's what happens afterwards. Some people say they're no longer afraid of death. Others become more spiritual. Some change their relationships, some leave careers, some become more compassionate. Some become obsessed with understanding what happened. And people who report frightening experiences can be especially affected. Imagine believing you've seen hell, then waking up in a hospital. Imagine knowing that you almost died and remembering what you believe happened while you were there. Whether that experience came from God, from the brain, from consciousness, or from something else entirely, it could change the way you look at every day you're given afterward. Maybe that's one reason these stories continue to fascinate people. They aren't simply stories about death, they're stories about coming back. Maybe the scariest thing about hell isn't fire. Maybe it's uncertainty. We don't completely understand consciousness. We don't completely understand what happens during the final moments of life. And we don't know whether awareness continues after the body dies. We have religious traditions. We have personal testimonies. We have scientific experiments. We have theories. But no living person has returned from the irreversible death with a scientifically verified map of the afterlife. And that's the line we have to respect. We can investigate, we can listen, we can compare stories, we can study the brain. But we shouldn't pretend that a personal experience is scientific proof. And we shouldn't pretend that science has answered every question either, because it hasn't. In the final part, we're going to talk about what happens when we open the door. Tonight we've heard stories from people who say they came frighteningly close to death. Howard Storm described what he believed was hell. Bill Weiss described an experience he interpreted as 23 minutes in hell. Don Piper described what he believed was heaven, and countless other people have reported. Darkness, isolation, beings, light, peace, fear, and experiences they struggled to explain. We've looked at Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, Tartarus, Jahannam, Dante's Inferno. In the many different ways humanity has imagined the afterlife. We've asked where hell is, and the honest answer is, we don't know. There is no scientifically confirmed location, no coordinates, no underground entrance, no telescope pointed toward the gates. But there are people who insist they experienced something. And many of them say it felt more real than anything they've ever experienced. So what are we supposed to believe? Are these people remembering an actual journey? Are their brains producing incredibly vivid experiences during extreme medical emergencies? Are they experiencing some combination of physiology, memory, belief, and consciousness? Or are they seeing something science hasn't discovered yet? Maybe someday we'll know. Maybe science will eventually explain every part of the near-death experience. Maybe we'll discover that consciousness ends with the brain. Or maybe we'll discover that death isn't the ending we thought it was. Maybe it's a doorway. Maybe some people have already opened it. Maybe they've looked through it. Maybe they've seen something on the other side. And maybe they came back because they weren't supposed to stay. But there's one thing every single person listening to this episode has in common. Eventually, we're all going to find out. Every heartbeat we have is temporary. Every breath is temporary. Every moment is temporary. And someday, the heart will beat for the final time. The question isn't whether we're going to die. The question is what happens after. Is there nothing? Is there heaven, hell? Is there reincarnation? Is there something beyond all those words? Or is the truth something our living minds simply aren't capable of understanding? Maybe the people who came back from the edge of death have given us pieces of the answer. Or maybe they've only given us another mystery. But if even one of these stories is more than a product of human brain, then there may be places beyond our reality that we haven't even begun to understand. Places of unimaginable beauty and places of unimaginable horror. So the next time you're sitting alone in the dark and you hear something move in another room, don't automatically assume it's nothing. Because maybe there really is nothing there. Maybe your house is settling. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's your imagination. But if the people we talked about tonight are right, maybe it's the physical world isn't the only world that exists. Maybe there are doors between realities. And maybe death is the final door. The only question is when your time comes. What will be waiting on the other side? I'm your host, Ed, and this was Paranormal Inc. Ohio podcast. Till next time, keep searching for the truth. Keep questioning what you know and think. And whether you do, when the lights go out, don't assume you're alone. Thank you guys so much for coming and checking out tonight's episode. I love each and every single one of you, and you will hear from me from the next one. Bye, everyone.